Hello there, folks. Here I want to talk to you in the second video for week one about the world of early Christianity. Again, I'm referencing the lecture notes. You can find them popularly, and always just feel free to pull these up as you're watching my lectures. So let's think about how Christianity arises. If you read the McCullough book, you note that he makes this argument that he needs to call his book Christianity the First 3,000 Years, because you can't make sense of Christianity without thinking about both the Second Temple Jewish culture of which Christianity emerged and the Hellenistic or Greco-Roman culture as well. So let's talk about these two things, Second Temple Judaism and Hellenism, a little bit. Second Temple Judaism is a term that refers to the period from the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple after the exiles returned from Babylon in 515 BCE and the destruction of the temple by the Roman army in 70 CE. So there was an original first temple that's destroyed by the Babylonians. When the exiles return, they rebuild it. And then Rome finally destroys the second temple in 70 of the Common Era. You notice I'm using these two dates, BCE and CE. These stand for before the Common Era and Common Era. They've superseded the terms BC and AD, which means before Christ and in the year of our Lord, as a more inclusive form of dating, although the years themselves don't change. Let's also then talk about Hellenism. Hellenism is the spread of Hellenistic or Greek culture after the period when Alexander the Great conquers most of the territories in the Eastern Mediterranean. And Hellenism as a cultural influence is really felt from the periods between 324 BC and 30 BCE. 324, the period of Alexander the Great. 30 BCE, that is when you begin to see the emergence of the Roman Empire. Hellenism then is broadly influential. It impacts many local cultures and people. So that is non-Hellenistic, non-Greek people, by virtue of the conquest by Alexander, take on Hellenistic ideas and practices. So this will be an issue in the land of Israel during the Second Temple period. How does Judaism navigate Hellenism? And we can see the emergence of Christianity as occurring within that conversation and debate. So let's talk a little bit then about how Israel itself is located at the crossroads of cultures. I have a map from week one. It's the first map on the Populi site, and it really shows 4 different cultural zones of the first century CE. And we can move west to east across this map. So first we'll note that there's a Mediterranean civilization, which is really what we've been talking about here between the Greco-Roman, Hellenistic, and Second Temple Jewish contexts. We could also include Egypt in here, Carthage, other areas. A Mediterranean culture. Moving further east, just across the land of Israel, into what is now present-day Iraq and Iran, this region of the Persian Empire, which really was the great geopolitical rival to the Roman Empire. And the Persian Empire has a really broad swath from near the edge of the Mediterranean all the way over into what's modern-day Afghanistan, and then down south into the Arabian Peninsula. It has contacts with India, contacts with East Africa as well. Then again, moving east and southeast, looking at the Indian civilizations of the South Asian subcontinent. There's all kinds of cultural contacts then happening between India and Persia, and great civilizations emerging there, literature, architecture, kingdoms, and so on. Then moving up to the north and northeast, various Chinese cultures. The Han Dynasty is dominant at this time. And then that has connections over to Japan, down into Southeast Asia. There's an idea that perhaps even Chinese sailors made it to the Pacific coast of what is now North and South America. So there's all kinds of connections we can begin to see, because I have a second image that is a map of various trade routes that you can find connected. And we can find the Silk Road on there, various spice routes. So we can think about Mediterranean civilization as isolated, because it's often what a European American context is thinking just about Europe, the Mediterranean, and sees it as culturally isolated. But no, there's actually lots of connections. You can get spices from India, silk, so on, and you find it in Rome. We can find ivories from Africa that move up into Northern Europe and England. So let's begin to think then about the land of Israel as perhaps more culturally connected than we might have assumed. Alongside that, we have to think about then the land of Israel as being a colony that's subject to Roman imperial power. King Herod, the Sanhedrin, the high priest, the leadership of the land of Israel has to figure out how to navigate being subjugated to an imperial power. That's another dynamic that's playing out in early Christianity, and a dynamic for Israel as it finds itself in this Mediterranean context. This lets us move into thinking about how Judaism exists in the first century of the Common Era. There's two things that are most important for Judaism. One is the temple, located in Jerusalem. The other is Torah, that is the revelation God gives to Moses at Sinai. Both of these things are vitally important. The temple is the focus of worship that Israel, the Jewish people, offer to God. It's commanded to do this. The temple in Jerusalem has become its focus. It is the site of pilgrimage festivals. Jesus often is found in the temple precincts. Paul in the New Testament writes about the importance of continuing to collect for the poor in Jerusalem, which probably is related to poor relief the temple navigates. It's really common in some circles of contemporary Christianity to talk about the temple system as being oppressive. This usually comes out of a more progressive Protestant perspective. I think what's happening here is often folks read stories like Jesus and the money changers in the temple and begin to think that the temple system itself was oppressive. That people felt oppressed by the temple. But actually, there's not really any good evidence for this. We read early Christian accounts, we read Jewish accounts from this time period, and throughout them all, they talk about the temple as a positive thing that they seek to be in the presence of, not an oppressive system. So when we think about temple, try to let notions of oppression go. Torah forms Jewish life. Torah doesn't mean law. That's really a bad translation. It means something like the way or teaching. It's an orientation to how to follow God in all aspects of life. Torah is what Jesus teaches. It's what Paul seeks to emphasize when he talks about the gift of God in Jesus Christ. Again, sometimes contemporary Christians talk about law as something that was oppressive that Jesus freed people from. But when we go back and read Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus talks about how to follow Torah, and ask yourself, is this an oppressive system that Jesus is trying to set up? Or is he trying to reinforce a positive and life-giving thing? Now, if we see temple and Torah as the two poles of Jewish life, there then becomes a question of, how am I going to be a Jew if I'm not near the temple? If I live outside the land of Israel? What does it mean to be a Jew when my land has been colonized and I can't control all aspects of my life because of what the Roman Empire is doing? How do I, as a Jew, navigate a Hellenistic world that might conflict with my Jewish identity? These kinds of questions were constantly being debated and navigated by Jews in the first century. And so we shouldn't think of a single monolithic Jewish system, but rather of multiple expressions of Judaism that operate in this era. There is no single group that defines exclusively what it is to be a Jew. Rather, we can say a Jew is someone who identifies as a member of the people of Israel by birth, cares about the temple, and cares about Torah. And then there's going to be many expressions of Judaism. So let's think about some of those. There are regional expressions of Judaism. So I have a map that shows the land of Israel and adjoining areas in this time period. We have the region of Judea, which is where we'd find Jerusalem. The region of Perea, the region of Galilee, where Jesus comes from. So we can note that a Judean and a Galilean might have different experiences of what it means to be Jewish. We also have the region of Samaria, which is populated in large part by people who were members of the tribes of Israel who were not taken into captivity by the Babylonians, but then intermarried with other folks, and sort of a new identity emerges among the Samaritans, as we sometimes read about in the New Testament. In Idumea, which is to the south, which was another tribe that joins Judaism during the Second Temple period, and actually King Herod and his family are these newly joined Jews, the Idumeans. And then we can think about Judaism in the diaspora. Diaspora is another word for talking about life in exile, scattered among the nations. So looking to the Persian Empire, not everyone who was taken into exile in Babylon, not all those descendants returned. Some Jews stay behind. And in Babylon itself, a vibrant Jewish life was established. Some of the great rabbis of the early Common Era come from Babylon. Other Jews go elsewhere out into the Eastern Mediterranean. Some Jews settle in Egypt. There's vibrant communities in places like Alexandria. You can also find Jews living in Syria. Damascus features so heavily, along with Antioch, in the New Testament. These two cities in Syria where Jews are living. And that matters a lot for when Paul gets there. And then finally, we find Jews living in Rome itself. There was a family that ruled the land of Israel, had liberated themselves from the Greeks. This is the Hasmonean family. We read about them when we think about Hanukkah. The Hasmonean dynasty created a treaty with the Roman Empire that allowed Jews to settle in Roman areas and leads to Rome, when it conquers the land of Israel from the Hasmoneans, to recognize Judaism as a legal religion in the empire, which is why Jews are never compelled to participate in the cult of the emperor and worship of the emperor. Okay, I hope that helps set up a way of simply thinking about the Jewish and Hellenistic matrix out of which Christianity then begins to emerge. So let's think about the Jesus movement, this movement of followers around Jesus that leads to the birth of Christianity. One of the assumptions I'm going to work with here is that we can't really distinguish something called Judaism, or rather, we can't really distinguish Christianity from something called Judaism early on. That is, initially, the followers of Jesus, the Jesus movement, is one iteration of being Jewish in the first century. Let's think about this in terms of covenantal promise. So in Genesis 12, verse 3, Abraham is promised a covenant with God. And part of that covenant, along with descendants and land, is that the descendants of Abraham will be a blessing to all nations. That is beyond Abraham's family, which becomes the people of Israel. These other nations, which we'd also use the term Gentile to describe. Now go to the end of Matthew 28, where Jesus gives the Great Commission. He says, "Go forth and proclaim the kingdom to Jerusalem, to Judea, to Samaria, to the ends of the earth, to the nations." That Great Commission is part of fulfilling the Abrahamic promise. So let's think about this movement from Jerusalem to Antioch that we see in the Acts of the Apostles. When we read the Acts of the Apostles, we see this depiction of a group of Greek and Aramaic. That's Aramaic is the local dialect of Hebrew spoken in Jerusalem. And there's this grouping then of Greek and Aramaic speaking Jews who gather to worship regularly together. They continue in temple worship. They preach in the synagogues, which are not houses of worship. They're more houses of study. And these Jews appear to be mostly Greek speaking. If we follow the Acts of the Apostles, we see them moving to Samaria, to the coastline, to Damascus, to Antioch. So moving out of predominantly Jewish context to increasingly Gentile contexts. Wherever they go, the followers of Jesus, they first go to the synagogue, the local Jewish place of assembly and study. If their message is not received there, sometimes it is, but if it's not received there, then they go to private homes and to marketplaces. So we can think about the story of Priscilla welcoming Paul into her household after she encounters him preaching in the market. Antioch is a really important place where Christianity begins to debate the question of how will it deal with Gentiles in its midst. So, Gentiles become drawn to the teachings of the followers of Jesus, and they begin to join Jesus-believing Jews in their communities. And they begin to eat ritual meals together. The Lord's Supper, but also certain agape meals. Now, who you ate with said a lot about who you were in the ancient world. And Judaism had particular prescriptions and prohibitions around mixed eating with Gentiles. Other groups did too in this time period as well, by the way. This leads to tension and the convening of what we call the Jerusalem Council in 48 of the Common Era. You can see this outlined in Acts chapter 15 and Paul's letter to the Galatians. So the question is, do Gentiles who believe in Jesus need to become Jews via the process of circumcision, or if you're a woman, other ritual immersions? And do they need to keep all of Torah, all 613 commandments of Torah? The decision is no, they do not need to do this. The gospel of Jesus Christ has covenantal belonging for Gentiles also. But they do need to abide by various ethical teachings of Torah. So ritual and ceremonial practices are not required. But if you read the decision of the Jerusalem Council carefully, you realize there's all sorts of morality prohibitions in there. And that is also about purity. So perhaps not circumcision, ritual baths, but avoiding idolatry, avoiding sexual promiscuity, avoiding certain kinds of ritual offerings of meat are all about creating the purity of the community that follows Jesus. So purity still matters, even if not all aspects of Torah are observed. What this does is really establish Christianity as a variant of Judaism within Judaism. And it's also going to lay the seeds for a differentiation between Christianity and Judaism in the first few centuries of the Common Era. This is going to be something we are going to pay a great deal of attention to. I'm going to end our session here now. I hope this gives you a lot to reflect on, and in particular to keep on thinking about how context is going to inform how Christianity emerges. And to think next week with me about how the context of being in both a Hellenistic and Jewish world will begin to shape Christian thinking and practices. Okay, that's all for now. I look forward to our conversations.